Hello, friends, and welcome to Season 2, Episode 5 of The Membership, a podcast about the work and life of Wendell Berry, the farmer poet, novelist, essayist, activist, and thinker. My name is John Pattison, and I'm joined tonight by my fellow member, Tim Wasem.
Hey, John. It's good to hear your voice.
Tim. Yeah, you too. It's been a while since we recorded.
Yeah, we in the midst of all the COVID-19 madness, we definitely in our scenarios, it hasn't become easier to get a podcast released. It's gotten harder. I know some people have been getting a little more freedom to work on projects like this, but I know for us, with working from home / teaching 4 different grades of elementary school and and just being with our families, it's become difficult. But I'm glad to be back on track, and like I said, it's just good to hear your voice because we've basically communicated through text for a month and a half now, so it's good to see you.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. I feel like in some ways my life is so much simpler, and at the same time, it somehow seems busier, and I think it's just because people like you haven't been babysitting our kids for 8 or 9 hours a day.
Yeah. Well, I have a theory on that. Is just it feels like we're in a simpler time, but a busier time because we can't compartmentalize our brain at all. It's always, You're always doing everything all at once. You're parenting, working, managing a household all at the same time, rather than like, I can't do the dishes now. I'm at work. Like I'm somewhere else. I'm in a different building. Whereas now it's everything all at once. And so that gets exhausting. I know in our household, we get to about Thursday and both of us kind of, Jane and I just kind of hit the couch at the end of the day, kind of just worn out because keeping up with homeschooling and everything, but
yeah, totally relate to that. I think I said somewhere on Twitter or something that the hardest adjustment for me personally has been not the loss of freedom of movement, but the freedom of focus, because I feel like I have 5 or 6 conversations happening at any given time. And so that's been, and my wife feels the same way. And so that's been an adjustment for sure. But this is one conversation I've been looking forward to having. We actually did try to record back in late February, I think, and then we had some really great guests lined up, but we really had trouble with getting everyone together. So that was a disappointment. I'll talk a little bit about those guests here in a minute, but they're doing a really cool project, and we'd like to have them again, have them on for real sometime soon. But just couldn't make it happen for Nathan Coulter. What we do at the start of a lot of our podcast episodes is we start with what we call Farm Fresh Points. And we have a few today. It's because we're kind of going through our backlog. And I wanted to start with one. We heard from a listener through Instagram who asked about a song that she had heard called Burley Coulter at the Bank, and it was by a folk singer named John McCutcheon. And she asked if we knew what storyline this song was from. And basically, from what I can gather from the lyrics, the song is sort of told from the perspective of a local Port Williamite who goes off to college and then comes back home to work at a local bank. But then the local bank is sold to a mega bank. And one day, in walks Burley Coulter. He's a man of a different era in this song, and he needs money to live out the rest of his life. And we're not really told exactly what's happening, but it seems like he's mortgaging his property, mortgaging his farm or something else, just to pay for the last few years of his life. It's terribly sad, especially because I encountered it right after reading Nathan Coulter, where Burley Coulter plays a big part. And as far as I can tell, I don't think it takes place in any sort of canon Port William storyline. It's almost like an alternative Port William universe. But it's very moving, a very sad song. So I recommend going out to listen to it. It's called Burley Coulter at the Bank by John McCutcheon. Tim, did you have a chance to listen to that song?
Yeah, I listened to it.
Chatted about it?
Listened to it several times, and I agree that it was like, you hear it and it feels like it's almost like a different fly on the wall in Port William. Somebody who obviously doesn't have the voice of Wendell Berry, and you don't see that very often, where you hear that outside voice describing a character, and it was incredibly sad, but it gives you the really gratifying brain exercise of filling in the blanks of like, how does Burley get from the last place I saw him to here, and that's really interesting. So I'm definitely glad it's out there.
Yeah, for sure. My second Farm Fresh point is actually about the guests that we wanted to have on last time. They are doing a project on Instagram called the Membership Read Along, and their names are Kiri and Alicia, and I hope I'm pronouncing Kiri's name correctly. But they're doing this cool project where they are reading the Port William fiction, I believe one book a month, all throughout the year of 2020. And their first book, because it takes place, well, actually, I think because it was the first book Berry published, was Nathan Coulter, and so we were hoping to have them on to talk about that, but it didn't really work out. But that said, you should totally follow the project that they're doing on Instagram. Just go to hashtag the membership read along, and you can follow along with what they're doing. It's pretty cool, and they're just awesome readers. I follow both of them now, and I just love seeing everything that they're reading. Not just Wendell Berry. So those are the two that I have for now. Tim, what about you? Do you have any Farm Fresh points?
Yeah, I've got several. They've been kind of building up over time. One that I've been wanting to talk about I guess I found out about this right when we were going to first record this, so it's been a couple months, but there's a new anthology of photographs and short essays about from some of Appalachia's best writers that's called Step Into the Circle, Writers in Modern Appalachia, that I found out about through, I want to say it was through Wiley Cash, had posted something, and Wiley Cash is a writer I really love who wrote A Land More Kind Than Home, and he is included in this collection. Also, Wendell Berry is in the collection, Ron Rash, who we've talked about before, Silas House, Adriana Trigiani is in there, and then it's edited by Amy Green, who's the author of a really fantastic novel called Bloodroot that I read several years back. And so I was just excited to see all those names in the same place. It's available most places, and I actually haven't gotten my copy yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. Part photo book, part essay collection, and it's all just kind of praise for the mountains and valleys of the region. So I thought
Is it all nonfiction, or is there some fiction, some poetry?
Looks like it's all nonfiction. Short essays and photographs.
Okay. That's right. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That sounds great.
Yeah. Next thing was there a few of Wendell Berry's books were re-released on audiobook. Actually, I shouldn't say re-released. One of them was released, which was an older book, which is The Unsettling of America. The other is the World-Ending Fire, which is his newer selected essays collection, were released on audiobook, and they're being read by Mr. Nick Offerman of Parks and Recreation fame. And
awesome.
It is pretty cool because we've talked about before that he's a Wendell Berry super fan. He's very heavily influenced by Mr. Berry, and so I'm sure he was just giddy to get on those projects. And so I purchased the World Ending Fire collection, and I've been listening to that and really enjoying it. I think the last essay I listened to is Think Little, and he definitely, because Ron Swanson and Nick Offerman are not the same person, and sometimes it's hard to reckon with that reality.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if you've listened to the audiobooks, but when he reads it, it sounds like Ron Swanson. It doesn't sound as much like Nick. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he'd be mad if he heard that, but I appreciate it. Like, it's just he reads it with that same kind of confidence that you can imagine Ron projecting. But it's really well done, and the World Ending Fire is a great selection of essays, so I'm really glad that came out. That was a fun treat to come across, and I had a Audible credit burning a hole in my virtual pocket, so I picked it up. Have you listened to
That's
either
so
of these?
Cool. No, I haven't, and actually I didn't even know that they were available until just like a week ago when a friend sent me a link. I've wanted there to be nonfiction audiobooks for a long time. Mm-hmm. And how cool that it's Nick Offerman reading these.
Yeah.
I just think that's great. We are rewatching Parks and Rec with my 12-year-old right now, and it is so fun to introduce her to these characters that we love.
That's cool.
Especially Ron Swanson.
Yeah.
For me, at least.
So many good characters. Gosh. But yeah, he does an incredible job. He's a talented guy, and you can tell when somebody reading an audiobook cares. about what they're reading.
Yeah.
You can
Yep.
feel that, and so it's definitely prevalent. Like you can definitely tell that Offerman cares about what he's reading. The next thing I wanted to bring up was a podcast called Sugar Calling, which is from the New York Times or the New Yorker. Ugh, I should know that. It's New York Times, so it's through the New York Times, and it's Cheryl Strayed who kind of came to fame writing the book Wild, and the podcast is just her calling on some of her like old friends and having conversations about current events and about literature and all this stuff, and Sugar is her nickname, which explains the title. It's Sugar Calling. It says she's the one calling. But in the first episode of the podcast, which is called Everything Is Always Keep Changing, which is an amazing title of an episode, she calls George Saunders, who's another writer that I really admire and I reread frequently. And when she talked to George Saunders and they were talking about quarantine and COVID-19 and all of this that they're dealing with, George Saunders just delighted me by bringing up Wendell Berry. He kind of brings it up. He says, by the way, do you read much Wendell Berry? And she says, oh, yes. And he's like, well, I've been reading a lot of him recently. Saunders says that. I think something that we could get into, I think we'll get into in our next episode. We're talking about some of these more recent essays that he is the type of writer that during a time like this, you kind of are drawn to, right? Or drawn back to. And I was going to read the poem. He shares a poem in the podcast. He shares the poem, The Wild Rose, which is a love poem Wendell Berry wrote to Tanya Berry. So I want to read this. He said this is a poem that's been on his mind. I'm not going to dig into it, and you can listen to him give his much more eloquent explanation, but I just wanted to read the poem that he said has been on his mind during these times that we're in. This is The Wild Rose. Sometimes hidden from me in daily custom and in trust, so that I live by you unaware, as by the beating of my heart. Suddenly you flare in my sight, a wild rose looming at the edge of thicket, grace and light where yesterday was only shade. And once again I am blessed, choosing again what I chose before. So I really encourage you to hear him talk about that poem and bring up Wendell Berry. But I mean, I think you can tell the draw to that poem during these times is that this time is kind of forcing us all to make sure we're focused on the right things and focused on the right people and giving attention to the people who really deserve it in our life, and not. It's encouraging us to not let ourselves be pulled around and jerked around by the world. So really loved hearing that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Now the last one I was going to bring up, which we've been kind of working on for a while, is my sister, who's a graphic designer, has helped us design a new logo for the membership, which we're going to be putting out soon. And I think the idea for this originated with you, John. You want to tell them like what your original kind of concept was for?
Yeah, early on as before we launched the podcast, we were talking about different ideas for our logo, and I'm really good at coming up with ideas, but not necessarily knowing how to execute on them. And so without knowing anything about graphic design or about barn quilts, I said, well, maybe our logo should be similar to a barn quilt. And I think we all liked the idea, but none of us really knew how to make that happen. And your sister is just an incredibly talented graphic designer, and she at least maybe still teaches other people graphic design, but she's done this really, really beautiful barn quilt style logo for us, which is just what we wanted. So that's very, very cool.
Yeah, my sister is a graphic design professor at George Fox University, Ashley Lippard, and she's a very, very talented woman, and she has a sort of recent exposure to Wendell Berry, especially through some friends there at George Fox who were very into Wendell Berry. And when I told her the idea and told her your concept with the idea with the barn quilt, she really dove in and looked into all of the traditional styles of barn quilt, and then, which I love, she looked into those and then just kind of like cut loose and came up with her own, which I think is a really cool, just a really cool way of designing something new, is being steeped in the history and then busting out with a new idea. So we'll be putting that out soon with our upcoming episodes. So you'll get to see our new logo, which we're very, very proud of. So thank you, Ashley. Thank you, sister.
Yeah, no
for doing
kidding.
that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And she made a bunch of different ones for us to choose from.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard for us to pick just one.
She generated like 15 or 20 or something like very quickly with these really cool color schemes, and I think all of us kind of quickly landed on the same three, and then it took us a little while to decide which one would be the one. But I think we're all happy with where it turned out. So,
one of the other thing I wanted to bring up, sort of here in Farm Fresh Points, and you kind of did some of this already. I was curious if there were Wendell Berry works, whether it be an essay, a story, a passage, a poem, that you've been coming back to during quarantine. I know that there have been a couple for me. One was sent to me pretty early on, and it's called Stay Home, and it's a poem. And I want to read it here too. Again, like you, I won't dive into, delve too deep into it. It's going to be pretty obvious what the connection is, but it's called Stay Home. I will wait here in the fields to see how well the rain brings on the grass. In the labor of the fields, longer than a man's life, I am at home. Don't come with me. You stay home too. I will be standing in the woods where the old trees move only with the wind and then with gravity. In the stillness of the trees, I am at home. Don't come with me. You stay home too.
That's really
another
beautiful.
is a quote from one of his essays that I posted on Instagram not long ago, because part of my routine that I didn't set out to create during this time, but has just developed over time, is almost every single day I go on the same 3.5 mile walk through the country near our house. We live right on the edge of town, and we call it the Loop. But it's been incredible to me that I've walked the same loop dozens and dozens of times now, and it's never been the same twice. It's always interesting. Always feels fresh, and I have thought back to this line by Berry where he said, "And the world cannot be discovered by a journey of miles, no matter how long, but only by a spiritual journey. A journey of 1 inch, very arduous and humbling and joyful, by which we arrive at the ground at our own feet and learn to be at home." And I think what's partly why that came to mind is because this loop, this walk, has always been available to us. We've driven it a couple times before, but we've never actually gone out and sort of taken that slow way and really gotten to know it better and gotten to know the animals along the way and some of the neighbors. We've never experienced it at this pace, and it was always right there waiting for us.
Yeah, that poem that brings to mind, I think, the line we've talked about before from Walt Whitman, from Song of Myself, where he asks the question, "Have you reckoned an acre much?" Have you thought? There's a section of Song of Myself where he talks about, have you really thought about the infinity that's right within an acre? I mean, this is a good time to learn to think about that acre or that loop. That's great. I have a poem I wanted to read, and this is a poem that I had talked about very early on in the podcast, because I had talked about how sometimes I like to get out my typewriter and type a poem out that I find meaningful, just to kind of go through that process of putting the words onto the page in a slightly uncomfortable way, And so I was in our basement, kind of doing some projects, working on some rooms, and came across that original one that I had typed out of this poem, which is called Work Song Part 2, A Vision. If we will have the wisdom to survive, to stand like slow-growing trees on a ruined place, renewing, enriching it, then a long time after we are dead, the lives our lives prepare will live there, their houses strongly placed upon the valley sides. The river will run clear, as we will never know it. On the steps where greed and ignorance cut down the old forest, an old forest will stand, its rich leaf fall drifting on its roots. The veins of forgotten springs will have opened. Families will be singing in the fields. Memory, native to this valley, will spread over it like a grove, and memory will grow into legend, legend into song, song into sacrament. The abundance of this place, the songs of its people and its birds, will be health and wisdom and indwelling light. This is no paradisal dream. its hardship is its reality. So,
Yes.
so that has come back into my mind over the last several weeks. And we can't not mention, and if you're spending any time on Twitter, this poem has been popping up, but the poem The Piece of Wild Things, which we've mentioned before, of course. So we've talked about that as being one of the most anthologized poems by Berry, and it's one that probably our listeners are familiar with, so we don't have to read that one. We don't have to. I mean, it's kind of always good to read it.
Yeah.
But encourage you to go back and read that once a day during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. That's great advice. I've seen it a ton on Twitter and Instagram too. You're right. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
Well, should we transition to talking about this episode's book?
Yeah, let's do it. I've been the irony of getting like into a dry period of recording when we're talking about our first novel, which is what I've been looking forward to since we started this this podcast. I'm really looking forward to talking about this.
Yeah, you've been waiting a long time. You've been we've all been excited, but you've mentioned it a few times, and so here we are.
Yeah.
So what's funny is, as we were getting ready to record this earlier with one of the two guests, one of you brought up the Counterpoint Presses. That's the publisher. Their summary of this book.
Oh yeah.
It's pretty bad.
yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
In as much as it's not at all accurate. So before we give our summary, here's how Counterpoint Press, bless their heart, they do such good work. Here's how they summarize it. When young Nathan loses his grandfather, Berry guides readers through the process of Nathan's grief, endearing the reader to the simple humanity through which Nathan views the world. Echoing Berry's own strongly held beliefs, Nathan tells us that his grandfather's life couldn't be divided from the days he'd spent at work in his fields. Now, it's important to know that the grandfather does die, but he dies off the page and off the very last page.
Yeah.
So if you've held off from reading the book because of that summary, I don't know why you would, or if you were sort of put off by you bought the book because of that description sounded so good, and then you read it and realized that's nothing. That's really very little about what the book is about.
It's sort of like an opaque inverse summary of the of the book.
All right, so here's my very, very short summary. So first of all, I guess we should mention that this was Wendell Berry's first book published. I think it was published in 1960 when he was just 27, and it spans just a few years in the title character's life, Nathan Coulter. The book ends when he's about 13 or 14, and it's bookended, very literally bookended, by two deaths. His mother dies at the beginning of the book. His grandfather dies at the very end of the book. And after his mother dies, Nathan and his brother Tom go to live on the next property over at their grandparents' house, and we learn a lot about the Coulter family. Nathan's father and grandfather are very hard men. They're generally good, but they're hard, and just difficult to live with. And so the book really sort of takes place over a series of either vignettes or set pieces. I'm not sure what the technical literary term is. Tim, you can help me out. But we see that he gets into some trouble with his brother. He has adventures with his Uncle Burley. And eventually he kind of drifts apart from his brother Tom when Tom gets a girlfriend. And then Tom leaves the farm after a fight with his father, where his father really wounds his pride. It's a very short book. It's a very coming of age story, but in it we're introduced to Port William and to a lot of to several of the characters that we'll see again and again throughout the Port William membership books. Is there anything you would add in terms of a short summary, Tim? You're usually much better at this part than I am.
I think that was great, and I think how you described the book was accurate as far as being sort of a series of vignettes, but I would probably take it a little further and say that it's almost like a novel that's formatted as a memoir. Is how I see it. Like the story is there is a timeline, there's a progression to it, but we see kind of a snapshot in time, and then it jumps ahead, and those two moments in time aren't necessarily like held together by plot. The novel doesn't. This novel doesn't really have a plot that drives through it from start to finish, necessarily. So, but I think you're right on. The other little thing I would point out is just the kind of prevalence of Burley Coulter as a father figure in the book for Nathan and Tom. So Burley, this isn't. Well, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say this isn't yet the Burley we know that's just kind of like hilarious. There's definitely some of that in this book, where he's kind of the entertaining character, but we get to see kind of a Burley Coulter origin story here, why he is the way he is, which I think was really fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we've talked before about how all three of us really love the character of Burley Coulter, and this is, as you said, his origin story. And it's funny, but it's sad too, and and difficult. But I think that you summarized that well, or at least improved on my summary of it. I'm curious if you had read this book before.
I'd read it once before.
Okay.
When I was in college, so it had been probably a decade since I had read it. I read it in college, and then I read it 3 months ago or whatever, and then I read most of it again kind of between now and then. Yeah, so I had you read it before?
I had. And there are a couple scenes in here that are among my most memorable scenes from the Port William fiction. So my second question is, did you enjoy it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I did enjoy it. I'm not sure if I've talked about this before with you, but I'm a avid fan of the novella format. I love books that land in about the 80 to 120 page kind of range. I love books that give you that like very cinematic feel to them. And a lot of his books are longer, but some of his, he's got a few others that are kind of in this vein with Memory of Old Jack and Remembering, some of these shorter novels. But I loved it just for that. I love the scope of it. And I really enjoyed focusing so much on one family. Like when I look back at the rest of the novels and seeing like, I really like how he really gets our feet wet with the Coulters here. And I wish I had read it first. I mean, of course, this is like a ridiculous thing to say, but having read this novel first, it would have made reading the other ones more interesting because you see the roots of the Coulter family throughout the other books. But I think this is probably I probably read this one fourth or fifth in line or something when I was originally reading his books. Yeah, but
so it's interesting. Go ahead.
I would just say, did you enjoy it? And I was going to ask you the same question.
Well, it's interesting you talk about the order in which you read it, because I asked myself upon rereading it, if this had been my first Port William book, would I have wanted to read others? And I honestly don't think that I would have.
That's interesting.
If I also had no experience with the poetry and the essays, I don't think I would have gone back, because I was really there were many parts of this book that I found impressive and even moving, but I can't say that I actually enjoyed it.
Okay. Yeah, that's really, I like that insight. I probably would agree with you now that I think about it through that lens, as far as if this was the first one I read. I think my main critique for it is that and I wonder if you'd agree with this in your kind of not dislike, but just you're not being very enthusiastic about it. It feels a little bit like an unfinished book. Do you get that sense?
Yeah. And did you know it was revised in 1985?
I've always seen that in the whatever the copyright notes or whatever, but I never really understood what that meant. So can you say a little something about that?
Yeah, I did some research. I found this in the book Telling the Stories Right by Jack Baker and Jeffrey Bilbro. There's an essay in there where they talk about this. I guess Berry in 1985, Berry cut more than 20 pages from the original. In the original, Dave Coulter, so that's the grandfather, actually survives the stroke initially. So the current book that we're talking about, he is. I mean, it's strongly implied that he's either dead or will very, very soon be dead. Mm-hmm. In the initial book, he hangs on for about a week after having this stroke, and then Nathan Coulter has an affair with Gander's wife, I guess. And so what the author of this essay says is that the revision actually underscores the importance of a good death to Berry. And so there are the four categories, I think the four characteristics, of a good death is timeliness, community, acceptance, and what this author says is the paradox of control that plays out between an individual and the natural forces of decay and what has come to be called the healthcare industry. Actually, maybe the last one is not a characteristic, but it's part of the story. So there's this theme of confronting death. Again, I haven't read the original version. I was just looking through the books of essays that I have on Berry for more information, and that's kind of what I found. I guess he also revised Memory of Old Jack and A Place on Earth. So I wonder, when you say that it felt unfinished, I wonder if the 1960 version would have felt more finished, but also less satisfying.
Yeah, well, that's
Once
good.
you see that Nathan Coulter had an affair with Gander's wife.
Yeah, that almost feels like, knowing that this is his first book that he published, I wonder if, this is total projection, but wonder if Berry was sort of revising it was a process of peeling all of the New York influence off of his story, or the sort of New York literary scene that he was part of, and that maybe he felt that he was putting something like that in, or had let the story take that turn because of maybe for showing more of a sacred attitude towards the plot or the conflict of it, rather than just the true experience of it. I don't know.
Yeah, it's pure, as you acknowledge, that's that's speculation, and I can totally see that. That's not hard for me to imagine.
Yeah, and I guess that logic maybe falls apart a little bit with the fact that he edited Memory of Old Jack and A Place on Earth, but I guess we can just think that those are for different reasons because those books were later. So, but I think that's just what struck me as far as Nathan Coulter goes. Yeah. Yeah.
So knowing that, does it undermine this book at all for you? I have to be conscious about not letting that undermine.
Knowing that it was edited?
Knowing the original version.
No, I think in my head it feels very easy to just trust that the artist put this version in my hands for a reason, and so
yeah,
I think that's a blessing that he is who he is, and he works with the people he does at Counterpoint, and has the publishers that he's had, because it probably has made it easier for him to have that kind of a control over his books, which I know a lot of authors would probably wish to have, which is not always the case. So yeah, it doesn't undermine it for me. I see it as, I want the version in my hand that I trust him enough to know that I should just want the version that he wants to be in my hand. So
yeah, and I think here's how I will reconcile it, and so that it's easier so that it doesn't have to be so intentional. I think when I heard that the book was edited, I thought of those last 20 pages as like a deleted scene on a DVD. It's part of the story, but we decided that you didn't really need to see this.
Yeah.
No, this is actually the story that Berry wants us to have.
Yeah. Yeah, or this is the story where he believes the most meaning, or the story worth telling is this one. So
yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
What are some things that worked for you in this book?
What
are some of its strengths?
Yeah, I already talked about the novella format. I really am just such a big fan of that. I liked the pacing of it for that sake. I like that it was a pretty limited cast of characters for the most part, and the thing that really stuck out to me as the most fascinating was the way that he treated relationships, and not just like romantic relationships, but just relationships between family members with this book. You had mentioned, I think this is a really good insight, that this is not an idyllic story of living in the country in Kentucky, and I really liked the dissonance between Burley and Grandpa. Is something that really stuck out to me. I like that they, in some ways, I saw them as being very, very similar to each other. They're kind of cut from the same cloth, but the difference is that Grandpa has more self-control and probably a little more of a worry about reputation than Burley does. And so the reason they butt heads so often is because they have so much in common. It's just that Burley is so much more of a free spirit, and that was really fascinating to me. Grandpa can go off and do something like killing the chicken or whatever, and that's that scene where he like hangs the chicken or whatever, and he can have these bursts.
I think it was a cat, wasn't it? Didn't he kill the cat too?
Sorry, yeah, he kills the cat. He like hangs the cat, and it's like he can have those sort of bursts of emotional response to something like Burley can in his own way. That was very fascinating to me. So I really liked that. I think this novel is rich with kind of little minor details that just continue to live on in my mind. A couple that come to mind initially are the character of Jig. I really enjoyed one of my, I think maybe my favorite line, which is kind of a weird line to pick as my favorite line from a book, but it's one that I think about regularly as a metaphor. When he's talking about Jig's house, who Jig is a character he says is crazy on religion, and inside of his house he has this just like wild system of gears and pulleys and things that run. And the quote is, he says that the whole inside of his house was a machine that couldn't do anything but run.
Yep, I underlined that too.
Yeah, that's a sentence that I think about often as a metaphor for like times in my life where I feel like I'm the situation that I'm in, or my work situation, or what we're doing at home. It's like we're not doing anything but creating a machine that just runs. It doesn't produce anything; it just runs. Gears spin, but nothing happens. So I really, really love that line. And as well, I also love the monument. The family monument that I guess it was Nathan's great-grandmother purchased is something else that sticks out to me as one of those minor details that carries weight. His great-grandmother was basically swindled by a traveling salesman into buying this just kind of obnoxious phallic monument in the this big just like spire in the Port William cemetery, and he says that that his great grandmother had bought it when she was, quote, old and childish, and that's a phrase that I also love very much. Yeah, she was old and childish, because that's where we start there at the beginning of the book, and that the presence of that gravesite kind of looms throughout the novel with Grandpa's disdain for it and the family's kind of embarrassment of it, and also, like you said, it was he's talking so much about a good death or about dying that it's a very appropriate, literally looming structure over the rest of the story. Yep. So how about you? What are some scenes or passages that are quotes that stuck out to you?
Well, I think what was I was struck upon rereading it by just how brilliant his characterization is. I want to say especially early in the book, as we're really getting to know these characters. And especially, I would say, with the father and the grandfather. Very late in the book, Berry says that the father and the grandfather couldn't have respected themselves if they hadn't fought so much. And we see that really early in the book. And there are a couple passages I marked down. This is about the father. And about the father, Berry writes, he said that when we finally, I guess it's from Nathan's perspective, he said that when we finally did get the farm paid for, we could tell everybody to go to hell. That was what he lived for, to own his own farm without having to say please or thank you to a living soul. That says so much about the character of the father. And then on page 21, there's this little passage about the grandfather where he's described as walking in such a way that he poked the cane straight out in front of him as if to get the air and everything out of the way so he could move faster. He always hurried, even across a room, setting his feet down hard. You could never imagine him turning around and going the other way. When he walked through the house, he made the dishes rattle in the kitchen cabinet, and you half expected to find his tracks sunk into the floor. In terms of the scenes that stood out to me again, and these are the scenes that stuck with me for years since I read it the first time, honestly, like, the scenes that stood out to me were the ones that involved, frankly, like, cruelty to animals. They're just they're so shocking, and sometimes told in such a matter-of-fact way that it's difficult. So there's a scene in which they stick like a dynamite cap up the bunghole of a crow. I feel bad even laughing about it. Because it's so cruel, and yet it's kind of funny too. I'm just a bad person.
Oh no, I'm with you. That scene, I remember, like, I was reading at the time when I was reading it. It was in school, and the students were working on something, and rare moment where I was like, I'm going to sit here and show them what an adult reading looks like. And I pulled out the book, and I started reading, and sure enough, it was that scene that I read that day. And so I burst out laughing in front of the class and had to explain it to them, which was, its own kind of awkward moment. But yeah.
So there's that one. There was the one where when the grandfather hung the cat in his rage. They had just had these volcanic temperaments, the father and the grandfather. And then the other one is when Burley gets the ducks and takes them to the fair and, like, sets up his own little attraction or game, I should say, at the fair. Then involves, like, trying to get people to throw a ring around the neck of the ducks. And he uses it to swindle a lot of people out of the money because the ducks always duck. And then, what else is a duck going to do? But then as the ducks get tired and Burley gets cranky, and I think he's had something to drink at this point. I can't totally remember.
Yeah, it's like right after he runs off and kind of disappears for a while to get a drink and doesn't come back.
Yeah.
And Nathan and Tom are running the booth.
Yeah. And he shoots the ducks. So yeah. Anyway, it's just they're cruel scenes in a lot of ways, and for that they've just stuck in my memory for years.
Yeah, that's it's not this one doesn't. It's not quite as cruel, but the scene with the fish, there's this kind of like parable-ish story of when Nathan and Burley catch that gigantic fish, this just like huge fish. I guess that also leads to when they were throwing another cruel scene with animals is when they're throwing the dynamite into the water. Remember that scene where they throw it in and, like, kill all the fish in the water, and the game warden's like, oh, thanks, like, scoops out the fish and takes them with them, or whatever, like. But there's that scene where they catch this gigantic fish, and it turns into this. I don't know. It's like it feels like a little parable or something where they take it in town. They start to show it off, and they have these big plans for it to become this big fish roast, and they're gonna have friends. They're gonna fry this fish, and it's gonna be the best thing they've ever had. And then it's almost gets to the point where the fish has taken on a whole life of its own, and Burley kind of teaches Nathan a lesson through that by just kind of saying, like, well, it's not ours anymore, it's everybody's, and runs off. So that scene stuck out to me as well.
Any other scenes stick out for you while we're on that?
I think the last one is just the lightning storm that leads to the burning of the barn. So there's this scene where Nathan is basically going to stay with he has kind of, after his mother dies, he sort of has free range to just do whatever he wants to a certain extent, and he runs off and goes to hang out with Burley and Big Ellis, and I think Jig comes over, and they're all drinking moonshine or whatever it is. They're drinking, and Nathan's sort of a fly on the wall for this whole experience. This big storm starts, and there's it's kind of a very emotional scene. I'm pulling up the quote here in my book. It says, "The lightning got worse. Jig stood in the middle of the floor and watched it, as wild-eyed as a ghost. 'Burley,' he said, 'he could strike us down with one of them.' 'I reckon so,' Uncle Burley said. 'He could strike you down just like a rabbit.' 'He can shoot 'em like a rifle,' Uncle Burley said. It lightened again. The thunder clapped down, jarring the house. 'Oh,' Jig said. He fell on the floor with his hands over his face. 'Bullseye,' Uncle Burley said. The thunder bumbled away over the top of the hill. "Burley, that one struck something," Big Alice said. "It must have," Uncle Burley said. We went to the windows and looked out, but it was raining too hard to see anything. Jig was still on the floor, hiding his face. "Get up, Jig," Uncle Burley said. "You're not dead." He ain't even wounded," said Big Alice. But so there's that I love that little interaction. There's so much to feel and hear there, and then of course we find out that lightning bolt that struck something had struck the barn on the Coulter's land, and so there's a very powerful scene of them trying, with the help of the town, sort of trying to put out this fire. At the same time, the town kind of coming to watch it like it's a movie at a drive-in or something.
Mm-hmm. And you just see the father and I think the grandfather too, just working long after it's clear that the barn is gone.
There's nothing
can't be saved.
Right. Yeah.
But there's nothing else to do except for just to keep working.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe this is not going to be good podcast material, and maybe I should cut it out. We'll see. But that scene reminded me of something from another story, and I'm wondering if you can. It's not, but I don't think it's another Berry story, and I'm wondering if you know. And I feel like there's another. It's a barn burns down, and
are you thinking of Barn Burning by William Faulkner?
Is it where? So the memory I have is that like people are like bring them bread, and the ashes are mixed in with the bread, and it's like a kind of communion. Is that Faulkner?
Yeah, it's so I'm reading this. This is off of Wikipedia, the synopsis, but Barn Burning, set in about 1895, opens in a country drugstore, which is doubling as a justice at the peace court. A hungry boy named Sardi craves the stew and bread in the store. He's afraid his father, Abner Snopes, is in court, and so it's a longer one. But yeah, so his dad's being accused of being a barn burner, and then you kind of follow that through. So yeah, I think that might be the story you're thinking of, but it's been a really long time since I've read that story.
Well, the two had become conflated in my mind, and so I kept waiting for somebody to bring the bread, and it didn't happen. And so I thought, it must be something else. As we brought up before on this podcast, and even a little bit earlier, Berry's been accused of romanticizing rural life in his Port William fiction, and it's a critique that I understand, even though I don't totally agree with it. But as we've kind of gotten into, the life of the Coulters described here is very far from idyllic. There are certain parts of it that I think would have been wonderful to grow up, kind of having so much room to walk and explore, but it was a hard life too, and I think that's we especially see that with the violence in the book. We've talked about the cruelty to animals, but there's cruelty among humans too. Like as I said before, the father and the grandfather have tempers. There are smashed windows and fights and emotional cruelty and all of these things, and the life that they live is a ton of hard work. Berry has said that no creature lives except at the expense of other creatures, and you see just how much of their like blood, sweat, and tears they give to making a life on these farms. Anyway, so I'm curious, what how Nathan Coulter plays into that critique of that he's nostalgizing or romanticizing rural life. Because it doesn't really seem to fit that.
No, it's emotional cruelty as well between a lot of these characters. And I think you mentioned the father and the grandfather, but also the father and Tom, the son. I mean, there's that same. It kind of it trickles down to him as well, where the book concludes with this kind of. Like you said, you stated well earlier that Tom ends up leaving because his pride is hurt by his dad. But his dad just pushes him and pushes him and pushes him to be better. And he's like, "You got to go faster than that to keep up with me. You got to be better." When they're processing the crops, and it becomes this just really big kind of looming competition between them. That Nathan and Burley, who seem to be more similar to one another, seem immune to that kind of way of thinking, where both of them are more of like the stoic, I'm doing what I can do and there's nothing I can do about that, and if he's going faster than me, I know that I'm trying my hardest, and so you've got like the stoics, and then the sort of like Tom and Dad, who are really pushing each other. So I think that definitely looms big for me. There really is no relationship besides maybe Burley and Nathan in the whole book that seems idyllic.
Yeah.
Right. I mean,
Yep.
Nathan and Tom have their issues eventually, especially once Tom kind of gets a girlfriend and gets sort of moving into adolescence or moving into his teen years or whatever. And so definitely between Nathan and Tom's father is not a good father by, as far as like involvement in their lives. I mean, he's been through a lot, and when his wife dies, he just basically completely cuts himself off from him unless he needs labor. Is how they feel. Grandparents are busy in their own way. So yeah, really the as far as being idyllic, the only taste of that we get is just kind of the shenanigans of Burley and Nathan, but that's not really the real life of this world. So that's just kind of an extra little flavor on top.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Well, anything else we should talk about that we haven't brought up yet?
I mean, I think this is. I keep finding myself going back in my head to your comment about how you wonder if you would have read this first, if you would have kept reading into these stories. And that's really interesting to me because I'm thinking of people who are reading along with us or who might be reading along and starting here, and this maybe being the first novel that they touch on. And while I think we've touched on a lot of really kind of charming scenes or scenes that are funny, right? Or scenes that are moving to us or lines that really mean something to us. I think it might be interesting just to finish by talking about what is it that some of the later novels of Berry have that this one doesn't. Which is a big question to pose kind of on the fly, but it just kind of gets crossing my mind because I think you really hit something there. So does anything come to mind to you initially, like that maybe Jayber Crow or Place on Earth has that this one lacks?
Yeah. Something does come to mind. The thing is, I know that I've mentioned this before, and so I am repeating myself, which I have a tendency to do. I'll just say that one of the... So when I hear folks critique Berry for romanticizing rural life, he doesn't need me to offer a rebuttal, but I give one anyway. Because my understanding is that one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to create a town in which more people than normal recognize that they are a part of this membership, and so a lot of his fiction does show the beauty of close knit community, and also the hard things too. For sure. That is what I missed from this book. Is you don't see much of the beauty of it, and that's what we get in a lot of his short stories and in a lot of his other novels. That's how I would describe it. What about you, though?
Yeah, I think there's something about. I think of Jayber Crow kind of comes to my mind as a book that kind of a gold standard novel of his, or Hannah Coulter comes to mind. And I think maybe the one thing that could be lacking, but is not, in my opinion, isn't really a fault of the book, is just that this is the only book that I can think of that's told from it's the only book that's told from a child's perspective, right? And so one thing you don't get from this book that you get from other books like Jayber Crow and A Place on Earth, which is just kind of a third person narrator. It's not, but whether it's Andy Catlett, that kind of older character, but is that you don't get the musings that you get in the later books, right? You don't get Jayber Crow sitting alone in his barber chair, kind of thinking through things and thinking back on memories and really wrestling with those things, and you don't feel the slowness of life for old Jack, right? You don't feel those kinds of things. So you experience this book much like a child experiences the world, which is like you look back and you've got like a handful of memories that stick out to yourself, right? But some of these later ones, you're in it for a very wonderful long haul. When Hannah Coulter walks you through the length of of a story and kind of takes time to stop and look back on things and really process them out loud. That's something we can't necessarily expect a 13-year-old narrator to do, or even if he's writing it as an older person, obviously. But I think that's one thing that it makes it different. It makes it stand out as kind of a different beast than the others. I don't know if I'm misremembering, please point it out. But is there another novel that has the
well, there's
perspective?
Andy Catlett Early Travels.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I think even in that one, it's been a few years since I've read that one, but I think even in that one, he's looking back.
And he's also...
So it's about his early childhood, but he's an adult looking back.
And he's also the writerly figure of this, and so we can sort of trust that his tone's going to be a little different than this one. So it's interesting to almost think about this book being one of the only ones that's not like an Andy Catlett telling the story kind of narrative. But I think that's...
We'll see Nathan Coulter again and again throughout the Port William fiction, but he will be a big part of Hannah Coulter because Nathan Coulter is Hannah Coulter's husband.
Yeah.
And Hannah Coulter is usually the book that I recommend, like folks who are just coming into Port William membership fresh. Even though Jaber Coulter is my favorite of all the Port William books and my second favorite book of all time, I usually suggest Hannah Coulter as sort of the entry point because, to me at least, it seems the most accessible. I also love that it has a female narrator. Mm-hmm. This is a very male book, Nathan Coulter is. Mm-hmm.
Maybe explain some of the violence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Well, anything else?
I don't think so. Well,
we're going to do something fun and kind of break our own rules, because for our next book, we are not going to go in chronological order. We're actually going to skip ahead 47 years. We were scheduled to do A Continuous Harmony, which is a collection of essays from 1970, but instead we're actually going to skip ahead to 2017, and we are going to do Berry's most recent essay collection called The Art of Loading Brush. And so that is going to be great to hear to get Berry's voice and Berry's commentary on the times that we live in today. So that's going to be very, very cool.
Yeah, this is something we had discussed amongst the three of us that we thought would just be a welcome change, and maybe it just made sense to us that Wendell Berry is a writer who definitely speaks to his time when he's writing. You know, he's aware of what's going on around him, and it seems a shame that we wouldn't be covering The Art of Loading Brush or his recent writings until 6 years from now, or whenever we actually get to that. It just seems like a waste to be like, hey, you remember that Trump guy? Well, he had something to say. So it just seemed like a good thing to do. Is within a season we're gonna continue doing the progression that we've done overall, but we want to leave ourselves room to occasionally bring in more recent works, so we don't get to lose the joy of talking to them in the context in which they were written. So.
Yep, absolutely. Well, we're excited to be back at it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us. You can connect with us online at membershippod.com, and that's where you can see what books we'll be talking about next. You can find the older episodes, and you can sign up for email updates if you would like. The book we talked about today was Nathan Coulter. It was first published in 1960. We used the text that was copyrighted in 2008 by Counterpoint Press. Our next book, as we just mentioned, is The Art of Loading Brush, Berry's 2017 essay collection. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all at Membership Pod. The Membership is a proud member of the Rabbit Room Podcast Network. You can find more great podcasts at rabbitroom.com/podcast. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.